About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be much fuller if we understood it better. And I am Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and culture, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and their experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items, new research, and I'll answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. And Noetics is spelled Noetic. Now, through these programs, we've learned that although the medical world defines consciousness as what we're aware of now, most of what goes on in the mind is not in our conscious awareness at all, but goes on in other aspects of our being. Besides our normal awareness, which we call the conscious mind, there's what keeps our bodies going and includes our fears and beliefs about threats and dangers, the subconscious mind. And then there's what connects us with our highest ideals and guides us in our actions, the superconscious mind. We learned that we can change our state of consciousness, so we're aware of different aspects of mind at different times. And then we learned that the brain modifies whatever sensory signals it receives to fit past patterns of experience, following a default network or structure in the brain. This means that we perceive, we see, hear, taste, smell, and feel what our brains expect to experience based on the past. We learned that no one has yet been able to pinpoint how ideas and thoughts are formed in brain tissue. And we saw that our body often responds faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel, and before we're often aware of it. Some experiments have even demonstrated that a person's mind continues to perceive and process for as much as several hours, even when the brain and heart are flatlined and the person has been declared dead. Based on all of this, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the cells that make up the brain, but is in fact the activity of a field that surrounds and permeates the brain and the body. It's possible to measure at least a portion of this field because electromagnetic activity extends for several inches around the body, in what some say is an egg shape, extending from below our knees to a few inches above our heads. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists whether the body is functioning or not, and permeates and develops with the body and the brain. This means that the brain is best understood as a receiver-transmitter, receiving messages from the mind and transmitting them to the body, and receiving messages from the organs and the senses and transmitting them to the body as the subconscious mind. Some researchers are exploring how the two hemispheres of our brain are involved in this transmitting and receiving, from the world primarily through the left hemisphere, and with our mind through the right hemisphere. We've learned that the field of mind affects energy and matter around us in a variety of ways. For example, when the subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as either energy or matter in quantum physics experiments, depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. In the fact that people's bodies and their pets have been observed to change when someone they're connected with turns attention their way. that individuals and the collective human mind can change the readouts from random number generators, as on the network of computers run by the Global Consciousness Project in Princeton. Now, every field is a unique pattern of vibration that's different from other fields. And different fields can vibrate along similar patterns. They resonate with each other and affect each other across space and time. As a result, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual mind as part of a larger field. Some are equating the mind with the quantum or zero-point field out of which all matter and energy arise. And some researchers have been using the equations of quantum mechanics, of relativity, and of computer learning algorithms to describe the role of consciousness in the formation of matter. Altogether, these understandings help to explain things like what's called the law of attraction, how the world around us mirrors what our consciousness is focused on, like accessing information through insight, intuition, and channeling, how dreams affect the body and our consciousness, how music affects the brain and the body and connects us with other minds, how we can enhance or slow down healing through our thoughts, emotions, and visualizations, and how the belief in a treatment can help a patient experience healing in the placebo effect, how remote viewing could work and how telekinesis works, and how we can get into a state of flow in which the mind and the brain are in sync, maximizing our effectiveness. And finally, how all of our thoughts and emotions affect our overall well-being. You can catch up on our past shows, where we've learned all these things, on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, books, and authors that I mentioned. We're also on the streaming app called SoundCloud. Well, today I thought we would move a little further in trying to understand how it is that our current sciences can't really explain consciousness, why noetics is kind of a field of its own.
What physics is fundamentally about is the motion of matter. I mean, if we go back to sort of an old take on it.
Yeah.
And if you start with that, you say, well, okay, so what I need is, first of all, an analysis of motion. So that gets me to something like space-time. And I need an analysis of matter, which gets me to something like quantum mechanics. And you put those together and it gives you matter in motion. Any science that is ultimately just about matter in motion in some way ought to arise out of physics. So biology, for example, I think you would say, yeah, all biological processes I can understand as just matter in motion in a certain way. Matter, animals move around. You want to explain that. They reproduce. Well, that's a certain piece of matter with a certain structure being produced by another piece of matter with a certain structure. Right. So at some very deep level, that's the operation of the laws of physics. The exception to that in terms of something that could emerge in the sense of not coming right out of physics is consciousness. Because consciousness has this character which isn't the character of motion of matter. It has this character of subjective, having subjective experiential states. Pain, for example, is a subjective experiential state. And if you ask me, how does the existence of pain relate to the motion of matter? What classically people thought, like Descartes and like Locke, was that clearly there's no conceptual connection, there's no fundamental connection there at all. They always brought in God, as a matter of fact, to say God had to make a law to connect the motion of stuff in your brain with a certain experiential states, and God was absolutely free to make that law whatever, because there was no fundamental similarity between the motion of matter and pain. So I think consciousness is something that's really a very deep, intractable problem if you think everything can be explained by physics. I don't see anything in biology or economics or the other special sciences, chemistry in some sense pretty obviously, in a certain sense, reduces to physics. An example, computer science. If I have a computer, it's a physical object, and I could get a physicist to analyze it and predict what it's going to do on a purely physical basis. And I might say there's a little spinning colored wheel on my screen, and I ask the physicist, what's going to happen here? And he analyzes it physically and gets some very complicated equation and solves it and says, oh, that little thing is going to spin for 2.5 years and then it'll go blank. And then I hand the computer scientist a piece of paper, and he says, you know what, your program here, you got a loop in it. Step 10 is go to step 12, step 12 is go to step 10. Of course, your program's never going to stop computing, and so that little disk is going to keep spinning forever. Right. The computer scientist is giving me insight that the physicist didn't. Now, in terms of their actual predictions, the physicist will be right and the computer scientist will be wrong. That is, the little disk is going to spin for 2.5 years and then it'll go off because something blows out in the machine. Right? The physics doesn't care that it's a computer. The physics works independently of it being a computer. Special sciences involve bringing physical objects under different conceptual categories which provide us a different kind of understanding or comprehension of them. A long time ago, there was a notion of British emergentism, which goes back to the end of the 19th century. And at that point, physics was not so well developed. And so they thought certain chemical properties of things could not be explained physically. Or you had vitalists who said, look at what living organisms do. You cannot explain that physically. And the march of physics has just refuted that, right? We understand how biological organisms can reproduce through DNA, and we have a physical structure of DNA. We understand why it can replicate. So I think they just didn't understand what the power of physics was going to be. If you have a higher level science that's based in, say, functional concepts, let me take a biological case. So you had a gene theory that existed, say, from Mendel, where he didn't yet have a physical model. Right. So what were genes? How were they defined for Mendel? They were defined functionally. They somehow had to carry information about the structure of the parents. They had to segregate and reform in the child. Okay? So those are kind of functional considerations. Now, all kinds of physics could support something that does that. Physics that's not like the physics of our world could support something that does that. In our world, we figured out, given the physics of our world, we figured out the things that do that, right? DNA molecules and why they have a structure that allows them to do that. So in some sense, these functional concepts are broader reaching than anything defined in terms of actual physics, because they actually cover things that are not covered by actual physics. But the existence of them doesn't imply, the existence of actual genes doesn't take us out of saying there's more to reality than physics in some sense. They're just non-physical descriptions.
That was Tim Maudlin being interviewed on the YouTube channel Closer to Truth, talking about strong emergence. Emergence is one of the ways that some scientists talk about consciousness. They believe that the interaction of the cells in the brain is so complex that something emerges that is the experience of consciousness. And this is why a number of people are really concerned when machine intelligence appears to be increasingly complex. They think there will be an emergent property of consciousness, which in their mind is self-awareness. And because some computer programs that look like AI, that are actually just machine learning programs, bunch of data has been poured into them. They are simply reflecting the data that is in them. Anyway, people who are concerned about AI becoming self-aware are concerned that an AI device would see no use for human beings, which, if you're familiar with the work of Isaac Asimov in the 1940s through 80s, especially his series of books that include robots, the first law of robotics is thou shalt not harm a human being, thou shalt only help a human being. However, many, many, many stories have been written suggesting that that will not happen. But back to consciousness. The laws of physics describe what is going on at the molecular, chemical, and matter levels of things. Consciousness does not appear to work in ways that the currently understood laws of physics explain, and so consciousness is being spoken of as something outside of physics, metaphysical. And that's where most of the work that has actually accomplished anything has had to be. However, the implication of what Tim Maudlin is telling us is that we just haven't evolved physics enough to explain the dynamic of consciousness, that there is another level to physics that would help to explain it, just as there was another level of physics that explained how genes worked. We didn't have the physics when Mendel was first discovering that, there are these properties that can be isolated and separated and reformed, and they were called genes. Now we know that genes are strands of DNA molecules that separate and reform in new ways. So there may well be a new physics that emerges, or a deeper level, a level of physics below the level of quantum physics, if you will, or beyond the level of cosmological theory, one or the other or both, in which consciousness can be explained. It's a whole new realm. It means biology is probably not where we want to look to understand consciousness. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, a radio show exploring what consciousness is, how it works, and how our lives could be greatly enhanced as we understand it more fully. I'm Ruth Miller, your host, and that sound tells me it's time to shift gears, to look at a book, answer any questions you've emailed to ruth@noeticmoments.org, and maybe take a look at what's going on in the news or in the realm of research that can help us understand the role that our state of consciousness plays in our experience. Well, continuing this notion that the laws of physics don't explain what consciousness is yet, but may someday in the future, we need to recognize that what consciousness is extends beyond the body's experience. Way on early in the show, we talked about the work that Carl Jung did to help us understand that mind is not just what we are aware of in the moment, but includes other elements, the subconscious associated with the body and the fears and threats, etc., associated with the body, and the superconscious associated with our ideals and higher ideas of what is possible. Part of the reason Jung came up with that model was because he saw some very interesting things happening in the people that he was working with. He worked in mental hospitals, and he also worked with individual clients. And he found that there were often experiences that people were having that could not be explained physically, but were clearly quite meaningful to the people involved. One of the things that many people share with me, especially recently, we're here in April of 2024, around this eclipse, people are experiencing many, many, many more of these experiences where something is happening around them that has meaning for them, but there can be no physical cause for them. Carl Jung called these events synchronicities, S-Y-N, meaning with, and chronic, having to do with time. So these are things that are related in time and meaning, but not through physical action. I'm going to let a YouTube from the channel Law of Insights explain this further.
What did Jung believe synchronicities were? Well, he described them as circumstances that appear meaningfully related, yet lack a causal connection, which, in simple terms, mean situations that arise in our daily lives that seem way too coincidental to be mere cause and effect, have a deeper, unknown connection between the perceiver and the event itself, almost as if that event happened specifically for the individual, or that the universe aligned itself in such a way that the person and the synchronistic event happened to be at that place at that specific moment. More modern research in the field describes them as an entirely subjective experience between a human's mind and the outside world, basically saying they only mean something to us and have no larger significance. Jung describes these synchronistic events as a healthy use of the human psyche that can become harmful in cases of psychosis. So there are two sides of the fence: those that believe it's our own mind's interpretation of an event that causes it to appear important, and those that believe it's the event itself that is significant due to an unknown relationship between us and the cosmos. Although at first the idea of the universe communicating with us may sound far-fetched and even absurd, logical our thinking as a species has become. But when you think of how perfect the geometry and alignment of planets and stars, how the conditions for life on the planet are so perfect, and the sheer vastness of the unknown universe that we are nowhere near understanding yet, we think it's not such a stretch to believe we are more connected to our outside world than we ever would have first thought. So, what caused Carl Jung's deep interest and fascination with this subject that seems impossible to prove, let alone convince the average person of?
As I said, Jung's idea about synchronicity emerged from his work with his patients, both in hospitals and individually. And his story that he likes to tell, or liked to tell when he was on the planet, about how it truly came to him, is the story of a woman who is describing one of her dreams. And in her dream, there was a particular form of insect that in Egypt is called a scarab. It's a flying beetle. And many of us have scarabs from Egypt in various forms that someone has given us, or we've seen drawings of them. So she's describing her dream in Jung's office outside of Geneva, Switzerland. And it's a nice balmy day, so the windows are open. And as she describes this dream, what flies into the window but an Egyptian scarab? Exactly what she had been describing from her dream. Not at all a normal insect to find in Switzerland on a balmy late spring day. And Jung said this is something that happened synchronously and had great meaning for both of them. So he developed that term, synchronicity. Dreams were a great source of inspiration and understanding for Jung, and he found that most of us dream with characters and formats and outlines that are common across many different cultures. Another place that Jung found interest in the idea of synchronicity is the use of the ancient Chinese divination tool called the Yi Jing, capital I or Y, space, capital CHING, Yi Jing. And this is usually called in English the Book of Changes. The idea is that there are a limited number of combinations of 6, straight lines and broken lines. And these combinations of 6, straight lines and broken lines, seem to conform to specific states of consciousness or readiness to experience things. The I Ching is said to have been developed by a very, very early Chinese emperor and have been tested and used for literally thousands of years now. And Jung was fascinated with the high correlation, not necessarily causation, but high correlation between what the broken and straight lines might say, which hexagram, and the description that this ancient emperor had written for this particular hexagram might say about a person at a particular point in their lives. It fascinated Jung because they were often very synchronous. So synchronicity, yes, we are all experiencing it more and more. And as Jung found, the more unblocked we are, the more open we are to experiencing life as a flow of possibility, the more we experience synchronicities. Well, that's it for today's show. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, and on the SoundCloud app. On the website, there are links to archived past shows and titles and other resources we refer to on the show. And you can send me your comments and questions, which I'll do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.